Good evening and welcome to the December 18th lecture for the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Dr. Matt Peeples. He's going to be discussing the risks and rewards of social networks in the ancient Southwest, and he will be coming on shortly. Dr. Peeples is an associate professor and archaeologist in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University, and he's the director of the ASU Center for Archaeology and Society. His research focuses on integrating archaeological data and methods as well and models from the broader social and behavioral sciences to address questions revolving around the nature of human social networks over the long term. His work involves the development of large-scale archaeological settlement and material culture databases, fieldwork in the U.S. Southwest, and application of a variety of computational methods to archaeological data. If you would all please welcome Matt Peeples.
We're good. So thank you for that introduction, and I'm happy to be here to talk to the AHS group. The work that I'm going to be talking about today is kind of talking about two themes that have informed archaeology in the Southwest for the last decade or so, and especially my work. And I want to kind of talk about how the group of people that I've been working with for a number of years and I have woven together these different themes in archaeology in the Southwest into a new way of thinking about big picture, large scale processes across the Southwest and Northwest Mexico. And I'll use a specific example of some of the research we've been doing over the last few years. And there we go. And the two trends that I want to talk about first are essentially the idea that there's more data than ever before. This is kind of the era of big data, as people have often referred to it, where we've got more information being generated in a given year than anyone could possibly synthesize and analyze at a reasonable scale and things like that. And it's been referred to by people like Jeff Altschul as a fire hose of information. It's just blasting all of us. We have more sites excavated in the Southwest every year than we can generally deal with. And so we need to come up with new ways and new tools of synthesizing all that information and making something useful of it that goes beyond just individual site reports. You know, what can we do? What can we learn now that we have all this additional information? So that's the first theme that's kind of informed a lot of the research that I've been involved in recently. And the second theme is networks and the idea of how we can study archaeological networks using material culture, using geography and things like that to look at patterns of interaction through time and across space. And this plot that you see here, this little histogram here, shows the number of publications in archaeological networks between 1965 and 2021. And you can see here that there's been a huge uptick really in the last 10 years or so, where we have, you know, previously it was just one publication every couple of years. And in the last 10 years or so, it's been 20 to 40 publications in a given year. So it really shows that this has been an increasing trend. And the group of folks that I've been working with here in Tucson at Archaeology Southwest University of Arizona have been a pretty substantial portion of that blip as well. So let me just say a little bit about networks. What is a network in general? A network is just a formal way of looking at relationships among some kind of entity or actor, whatever that can be. And we usually refer to the entities themselves, the social actors we're interested in, as nodes. And these can be an individual person, they can be a corporation, a group of individuals, and a family. They can be really any kind of just social actor that can be treated as a whole. And we look at the relationships among them. And that could be, again, many different kinds of relationships, family relationships, email contacts, people that send each other email, people that frequently interact, friendship groups, people that are members of shared groups and things like that. The point is just that we want to look at networks that are defined in a similar way, relationships that are defined in a similar way along an entire set of actors. And this example that I have here on the screen shows that even with a small network, we can start to tell some things about the structure of relationships in a given setting. So in this set of nodes that I have here, I have a cluster in blue and a cluster in red. You can see there's far more connections within them than between them. So there's sort of a clustering going on there. And then we also have an intermediate node, the kind of go-between in yellow in the middle. And you would note that the blue cluster and the red cluster would be completely unconnected if it weren't for that one node in the middle. And maybe you can think of in your own social relationships like a place where you play that kind of role. You play that intermediate role in a network in general. And this is sort of a powerful thing, and it's been noticed for a long time. And I wanted to give an example that comes from work published by two researchers, Paget and Ansel, who were looking at the Medici dynasty in Florence. And they essentially, Florence has this amazing archive of historical relationships, of business relationship, marriage relationships, co-ventures, partnerships. It's just really well documented. The economic relationships among families during the height of the Medici dynasty. And one of the things that Paget and Ansel noticed is if you look at the Medicis at the beginning of the period of interest, they weren't necessarily the best position to be the family that would ultimately generate popes and kings and sort of transform a lot of Renaissance Florence and beyond. And essentially, you know, they were among some of the rich houses, but they certainly weren't the richest. They were among some of the well-positioned houses initially, but certainly not the best. But what they noticed is over the course of the 14th century, the Medici family became increasingly central to social networks among the popular high status families in Florence. So for example, in a network of marriage ties, there were certain people that you could only get to through the Medici family. So those relationships were sort of powerful in that way. And the same thing was true of business relationships. So by being in those intermediate positions, Paget and Ansel suggested that the Medicis gained additional status, which they then converted into wealth and power and other sorts of things. So that's suggesting how you can take a network position and convert that into something like gain, and a gain and an outcome. This next slide is a network that many of you probably have your own version of, but this is my own Facebook network here. And you can see here, all these people are people that I'm connected with on Facebook, and there's a line drawn between any two people that are friends, my co-friends essentially there. So if my friends are friends with each other, they have a connection. And one thing that's apparent on this is I have no friends that aren't connected to at least one other Facebook friend. So that's something about the way I keep my social relationships. But I can also divide this into clusters based on places I've lived and worked. My hometown, University of Texas, Arizona State, University of Arizona, places where I've lived and worked. There's definitely dense clusters there. And also, you know, mostly archaeologists on the left-hand side of the graph, mostly non-archaeologists on the right-hand side of the graph, and then my wife, Melissa, in the middle, who's the only person that's connected to all those different aspects of my life and things like that. So again, you know, you just with a simple graph like this, we can actually tell a fair bit about the way I manage my own social relationships, at least in that digital form as well. And another game that many people are kind of familiar with when thinking about networks is the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game. This is maybe not so popular as it used to be, but you start with one actor and you try to get to Kevin Bacon by thinking of people that have co-starred in roles together. So, you know, you could go from George Clooney, co-starred with Julia Roberts, who was in a movie with Kevin Bacon. So that would be two links in the chain connecting them. And the idea was that, you know, you could get to Kevin Bacon in fewer than 6 moves, you know, in general. And actually, this is possible because of the power of relationships and overlapping relationships. And it's actually, these days, again, we live in the age of big data where people have actually done this with the Internet Movie Database. They've actually formally looked at how central Kevin Bacon is in the network of actors. And while he's up there, he's nowhere near the most central actor. But he's only about 3 removes connected to almost every working actor in Hollywood. And I always, whenever I talk about this, I always give my students a second to guess who they think the most connected actor currently is. And I always look this up before I come. Any guesses in the audience here? Who it might be? No? It's currently Samuel L. Jackson. So, and if you look at the top centers in the network of Hollywood co-stars, the defining traits of those people seem to be people that are in big franchise movies like Star Wars, and also people that are in Quentin Tarantino movies. Those two things seem to be how you get connected to lots of different decades of actors and things like that. So, you know, when we're thinking about what central means, it doesn't necessarily mean like the biggest movie star ever. It means someone that's been in lots of different things with lots of different people because of the way we're defining centrality here. So, you know, we're interested in asking similar questions about how does network position play out in the archaeological past, and what can we learn about the positions of sites and regions that are in particular positions through time. So how can we use social networks and interactions among settlements, and how can they influence success or failure over the long term? This is a whole series of questions we've sort of addressed in the Southwest, Northwest in general. I'm going to give it kind of an example a little bit later here, but those are the kinds of questions we're interested in. And, you know, one thing that you might be interested in or asking about is how can we go from people's stuff pottery, buildings, the things people leave and use behind, and get to a social relationship among individuals. It's a lot easier to ask living people who they interact with or track email connections. But how do we deal with this in a situation where what we have is material culture? And this is one of the big things that the project started thinking about early on, back in 2008, when the Southwest Social Networks project was kind of getting off the ground, is how can we do this with material culture? And one of the things that, if you look at a lot of literature on material culture and anthropology in general, you'll notice is that there's a relationship between the things people consume and use and their relationships. There are strong connections among these things. And this is an art project by an artist, Sana Kavist, who took, it's called All That I Own, and they took pictures of individuals with all of their belongings. Essentially, these are just rooms full of everything that these people own. And in the reflections in that photo essay, the artist was talking about how, people that had similar things tended to operate in similar social circles and things like that. And they noticed that over the course of their work with these individuals. And that was kind of, the more we were thinking about that in our own work with material culture, we're thinking about, really what we're doing is we're trying to identify people that are consuming similar things that maybe are having more opportunities to have interacted because they're sort of interacting in similar spheres of economic interaction, social interaction in general. And we're lucky in the Southwest because we have a really diverse set of material culture to look at. Mostly what I'm going to be talking about today is ceramics, although we've looked at other lines of material evidence as well. But in the Southwest, ceramics are generally divided into types, which represent different design styles and traditions, and wares, which are broader technological categories that also have some design characteristics. And those change regularly through time. They're very easy to identify even in the form of broken objects in the Southwest. We have tree ring dated pottery types, and we have really good tight chronologies for many of these, so we can use these in general. And also we have broad regional distinctions and technologies that people are using. So for example, in the northern Southwest, people are typically making pottery using a coil and scrape method where they're coiling clay, rolling it out, and then essentially building up the walls of a vessel and smoothing it with some sort of tool. Whereas in the southern Southwest, people are typically making either coils or lumping clay together and then using a paddle with a stone anvil to shape that vessel that way. And that leaves kind of telltale symbols in the finished product that we can see in the archaeological record. And that pattern has a really deep history that extends all the way to the present. That's still something that persists even into contemporary potters making pottery in the southern Southwest and the northern Southwest. So by looking at design styles and technologies of pottery and the way they're designed into wares, the way they're divided into wares by archaeologists, we can get a better idea of how these patterns of interaction may have played out over the long term by looking at what we see what we see geographically. And this is a simplified version, but we might have, a set of vessels that are all of given ware in one region, and then we can sort of build on that by seeing connections among sites. Not all of these sites are directly connected to each other, but once we build everything up, you can get from every site to every other site in some number of removes based on the things that they have in common in general. And this is a simplified version of what we've done, but this gives you an idea of how we build up relationships among settlements using the materials they left behind. We're looking for similarities in the technologies and designs of the things they left behind, quantifying those and using that to draw connections among sites across the region. And that gives us something like this. This is from a 2013 paper headed by Barbara Mills that showed different network connections across the western half of the US Southwest from 1200 to 1500. And essentially, the darker colored lines are longer distance ties and the lighter colored lines are short distance ties. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of this here, but in general, you can see some broad patterns in the way relationships changed over time in this region. So for example, in the first couple of maps, most of the long distance ties are in the northern half of the Southwest, whereas in the last few maps, they're only in the southern half of the Southwest. So there's this transition in where long distance ties are active versus short distance ties. And that was related to a whole suite of changes that are occurring in relation to migration and other sorts of processes that we outlined in that article as well. But this gives you an example of how we can take material culture, think about how that defines connections, and then look at the connections across an entire region to sort of understand how interaction is changing through time. So the second piece of this outline that I was talking about today was, how do we harness this fire hose of information that's coming out these days? And this is an area where I'm kind of inspired by my colleague Charles Perrault at ASU, who's written a fair bit about this in his book, The Quality of the Archaeological Record. And one of the things that he points out is that a lot of archaeology has been about asking questions about things that are quantifiable that aren't actually quantified frequently. Like you'll frequently see statements like, this is a very widespread ceramic type or something like that. But we could actually look and see, like, is this in the top 10% of types that we know for this region, or is it in the top 25%? Those are maybe different things, but frequently we haven't really taken to that. We haven't really been quantifying things in that way. So that's one of the things that I think now that we have a lot of information in one place, we actually can be a little bit more specific in thinking about how we make statements that are qualitative statements that could be quantified in that way. And that's something that I actually think we'll be surprised by fairly often. The results aren't necessarily what we think they are when we actually start looking and comparing things directly. And the other side of this was thinking about the field of paleobiology, which was a field that for the early half of the 20th century was largely interested in tracking individual species and clades and things like that. That's largely what people did. And then in the 1970s and later, there was kind of a revolution of that field where people started to actually look at all the species together in a given chunk of time, rather than just looking at individual species and things like that. And they started to identify that change wasn't necessarily gradual through time. There were periods of time where lots of species changed, and then periods of times where lots of species didn't change for long periods of time. And the only way they could get at that was by asking a different question that they hadn't really asked previously. We've got archaeological data at a broad scale that we haven't had previously, and maybe we can start to ask some of those questions. If we're looking at change in ceramics in one region, is that a time period where the ceramics across the entire Southwest are changing, across all of North America? We can ask questions that we haven't really asked previously. And we're certainly not the first to think of this. There's actually a really long history in the Southwest of people doing this. In 1971, the Southwestern Anthropological Research Group began, which was a group of people that were coming together to try to systematically record archaeological information, not just in one project, but across lots of projects in consistent ways. And I think this project was essentially a little bit ahead of its time in a lot of ways, because there hadn't really been the methods for dealing with data at that scale available to them at the time. They had the idea, but the technology wasn't really there at the time. And they were asking questions about, why sites are located where they are in general, not in one specific place, but just in general across the Southwest. And that was an important project because I think it brought together a lot of people that ultimately would then collaborate on further work, compiling information in that way. And another big step along the way was something called the Coalescent Communities Project, which has a really long history, deeply tied to Dave Wilcox and Archaeology Southwest, where they'd essentially attempted to look at population history in the Southwest and the late prehispanic Southwest through time by compiling everything they could about archaeological sites in the region to map where people were through time as a context for all the other kinds of interactions and analyses that we do in general. And these maps essentially show some of the transitions through time, and you can see how population centers changed and transformed over the course of this interval here. But this is one of the first times where we were able to have that context for any given area across this entire large portion of the Southwest in general. And the Southwest Social Networks Project was building directly on this at first. And this was essentially taking the Coalescent Communities database and then adding material culture information to look at relationships on top of this. So we've got population, then we've got social relationships as we explore them using material culture similarities through time. And that's kind of where this project came together. And through that, we were able to address a lot of questions about how relationships change, not just in one place, but across much of the Southwest through time. And that project has now morphed into the CyberSW project, which is a much larger project here. And I've included kind of on the top row all the people that have been senior personnel, PIs on the grants, and then everyone else that's been involved in this project. There's really just an innumerable number of people here, and I probably don't even have everyone here on this, and I apologize for anyone that I left out. But the idea that I wanted to communicate with this is that the way this work is done could not be done by one person, two people, three people. This has to be done with huge teams. This is huge at this point, and we're dealing with lots more information, compiling it in new ways. So we have people that have different specialties here. So we've got computer information specialists, we've got geochemists, we've got sociologists, archaeologists, geochemists, maybe I already said that, and people that are specializing in data management and things like that, and also people that are connecting the way these data are used to descendant communities and things like that. So there's a lot of different work that goes in that involves lots of different expertise. But the Cyber Southwest project is essentially what emerged from that Southwest Social Networks project as a collaborative effort to provide baseline data for answering a variety of archaeological questions, and an effort also to deepen the connection between archaeology and the broader comparative social sciences. You know, we thought that we as archaeologists actually have something to say to economists and historians and sociologists and things like this. And this was an effort to kind of push towards that that's still continuing today. And a big piece of this was we took what had been the Southwest Social Networks database and expanded it greatly. And this is work that's still ongoing now. Just to give you an idea of the scope, you know, locations, dates, and population estimates for more than 25,000 sites, measurements and feature descriptions for 2,000 public architectural features, absolute dates for many sites, over 30 million type ceramics, over 18,000 sourced obsidian objects. So this is just a lot of information, right? And the idea behind this is that, you know, having all that information, if it's not really, really clean and treated really, really properly, it's just going to be a pile of junk, right? You have to actually take a lot of effort to ensure that these data are clean, consistent, compatible, things like that. And that's actually what a majority of the early work in this project was focused on. You can see sort of in that bottom slide there, you know, a lot of the data came from old floppy disks that are slowly dying. You know, the data we're getting from these things that we're supposed to save data forever, CDs that no longer are readable and things like that. So we're trying to rescue data at those sources. We're going to the literature, both the CRM literature and academic literature, and recording information to, you know, current contemporary typologies and standards. A lot of the project was actually going to museum collections, reanalyzing collections or analyzing collections for the first time in some cases, and even going in the field and relocating and recording sites in specific areas where we didn't have information in general. So combining all this information, it's a huge amount of work that involved a lot of different people doing archaeological work over the last 20 years or so, plus you know, the 100+ years of archaeology that's combined in everything that's done in the work that we're compiling. So it's a lot of information being pulled together. And we're really lucky in the Southwest that we have a record that is conducive to this. People have been interested in quantification in the Southwest a lot longer than they have been in other places. I'm learning as I'm talking to other people about that want to do something similar in other places. People were counting potsherds and dating sites way before other regions in this area than a lot of other places, which is really important. We've got architecture in the Southwest that's very surface visible. You can actually do a fair bit without excavation. In the Southwest, you can see and count rooms and structures and things like that in a way that is difficult in some parts of the world. In general, we've got the ceramics and datable materials like tree ring dates that I already discussed that are really distinctive and abundant at archaeological sites. So this is really sort of a situation that's really well suited to addressing this kinds of question. But I think also we've learned that you can do a fair bit even if the data aren't this freely available. And that's something we're sort of trying to communicate with other people that are working in other regions as well. And this is a video, short video that shows the Cyber Southwest website in action. So cybersw.org, you can all go and look and sign up for an account. And this is a website that actually lets you explore these data that we've gathered. So you can look at information from individual archaeological sites in terms of ceramic materials, obsidian materials, public architectural features like that. You can plot distributions of these things on maps. You'll notice when it sort of zooms in, it's locked to a grid. That's to not reveal site location information, for example, but you can search for individual sites, pull up tabular information. And this is actually sort of an older video, so there's even many, many more features on the current version now, but this gives you an idea of the kinds of things that we're doing. So not only did we want to gather this data for our own use, we wanted to make something available so that anyone could use it. And we're kind of excited to see what other people do with this in the future as well. So with that as the context, you know, thinking about this big database and network methods, I wanted to talk about one research trajectory that's kind of been a big part of what I've been doing over the last few years that involves these different lines and trajectories. And in general, one of the important things about networks from a sociological perspective, the way people talk about them, is that if two people are in similar places in networks, like if they're both in an intermediate place or both on the edge of a network, we might expect them to be similar in other ways also. So there's something about network position that drives differences in outcome among people, settlements, and things like that. And this is kind of a classic model in social network analysis in general, is that network position is a major driver of relative advantage, influence, and outcome. This is going all the way back to the 1960s. People were talking about this in general, and the idea that structurally similar positions should lead to similar outcomes. So if you're in a similar place in a network to someone else, you probably are going to have a similar outcome over the long term. That's essentially the notion there. And this was a response in many ways to what social network analysts saw as the kind of atomistic view of early sociology, which saw just like the capabilities of individuals is what drove differences and things like that. They're saying, no, it's actually social positions that are an important part of that. In more recent years, sociologists, including Patricky and Breiger here at University of Arizona, have been looking at other sorts of influences on how that relationship between network position and outcome plays out. And one of the things that they suggested is this idea of they call cultural holes. The idea is that networks can drive differences in outcome, but the risks and rewards of a given network are likely to differ based on the cultural values and historic trajectories of that individual place. So that means that just, culture and history matters when we're thinking about how a position is valued in a given setting. So we have to consider the role of cultural and historic trajectories and evaluations of structurally similar positions. And I'm going to give you an example of kind of what I mean by this and walk through with how this is related to our own research. And you saw this slide already, and I talked about those intermediate nodes in yellow there. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more formal. A position like that is something that's often referred to as a broker or a brokerage position in a network. And a broker is simply a node that connects other nodes that would otherwise not be connected. So essentially, a simple way to think about that, if you've got three nodes, A, B, and C, B would be a broker if A is connected to B, B is connected to C, but A is not connected to C. So that's essentially what it is. You have to go through B to get from A to C. So you have to go through this kind of in between there. And when we look at this across an entire network with lots of different relationships, different nodes are going to more often be in that kind of a position than others. Some will be in that position very frequently. Others will be in that position fairly rarely. So we had noticed already in our work that there were some interesting patterns in relation to brokerage positions, and we wanted to investigate this further. So Randy Haas and I started investigating this first by looking out in the literature. What does the literature say about brokerage, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing? Is it an advantage? Is it a disadvantage? What does a broker do in a network through time? And initially we found a set of work that was largely coming out of management science and investigations of economic interaction among nation states and things like that. And that was suggesting that brokerage, being in a broker position, was a rewarding position for the person who was the broker. And you can sort of see in my little plot there, the person shaking hands with person on either side of them and thinking of all the money they're going to make by being able to intercept flows of information and resources. If people have to go through you, you're gonna accrue advantage. That's essentially the way that model worked. And we're referring to that as the individualist model of brokerage, where the individual broker is the one to actually gain from that interaction. And we thought that was interesting, but as we started to look broader, we noticed that there was a whole set of other literature, mostly from other parts of the world, not from the US. It was sort of published in other languages and then later translated some of it, which was had very different assumptions about what a broker was. And that's what we're calling the collectivist model of brokers. And this is in situations where tight-knit relationships among social groups are highly valued. Being a broker is actually sort of a less advantageous position, because you're sort of you have demands pulling you in both directions. You can sort of see people being pulled in multiple directions. People are maybe suspicious of people that aren't fully a member of one group or another and things like that. So we were seeing in the literature, there's these two different models of what brokerage is. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And as we were reading this, we're seeing that essentially, well, it really depends on how a given context values the risks and rewards of that relationship, right? If they value individual interaction and sort of that middle person position, then that person's going to accrue advantage. And if they instead value tight-knit connections among communities, then people in the middle are often going to be peripheral to those communities in general. So the idea was that, well, let's look at the archaeological record and see if we have better evidence for one of these models or the other. And the other thing that we thought about when we're thinking about the collectivist model, one thing that people suggest there is that it's often a really fleeting relationship where people that are in the middle have an incentive to actually bring people together, right? It's to their advantage to bring separate communities together to form one new, larger community in general. And that's a process that sociologists like Coleman, James Coleman, called closure. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we've got this network relationship we're interested in. How can we measure outcomes, what the outcomes we're interested in? We can look, we argued, at data related to settlement growth and size through time, population density, settlement continuity, and evidence for network closure. We can essentially see whether we see patterns that are more similar to that individualist model or the collectivist model in the archaeological record by looking at brokerage in relation to like population and continuity and things like that. And that's essentially what we did. And this first study was focused on the period from 1200 to 1450, which was the focus of the original Southwest Social Networks project. And really, a lot of our work at that time had been focused on the aftermath of migration out of northern Arizona into southern Southwest and all the impacts that it had. And we were interested in how brokers may have related to that pattern of population movement through time, where we see, you know, evidence of northern migrants in the southern Southwest, including in religious architecture, styles of hearths, pottery made in local environments in the southern Southwest, but in designs from the northern Southwest in general. So that was kind of the context behind this interval. And what we actually found is that if we looked at the geographic places where sites that were characterized by a high degree of brokerage were found, we saw that it was frequently in limited places. It wasn't just like everywhere across the Southwest there were brokers. There's only, at any given time, there were just a few places that would be characterized by brokers. And I remember this, when we first did this, we were working in the lab at the Southwest lab. We projected up the name of all the sites. They were in these intermediate positions. And we noticed that a lot of them had the name Gap or Pass in their name, like Chavez Pass, Tonto Gap, Largo Gap. And we're like, huh. So these are all places that are like at the place you have to travel to get across a mountain range or something like that. That's really interesting to us. So brokerage positions seem to be tied to physiographic features that funnel movement across the landscape. That's something that was really interesting to us in general. And you can see essentially through time, the Mogollon Rim itself and many of the passes along the Mogollon Rim are really where these concentrations are through time in that late prehispanic period. So that's interesting. There's definitely something about you know, the way movement is occurring across the Southwest that's maybe related to this intermediate position. When we looked at population, this is sort of a simplified version. We looked at it individually as well. But in general, the larger the mean brokerage was in a given environment, the lower population was. So population declines as the more intermediate you are, the lower your population locally likely is. That's kind of an interesting pattern there as well. When we looked at longevity, the sites that were highly invested in these brokerage positions tend to be among the shortest lived sites. So they tend to be sites that didn't last very long. They weren't occupied for many, many intervals through time. So again, that was interesting to us. We're seeing small, low population density places, short duration sites. And then that last question was like, do we see evidence of closure? Closure would be if two sites that are connected by a broker in one time period are then connected to each other in the next period. So if A is connected to B, B is connected to C, A is not connected to C in time period 1, in time period 2 is A connected to C. It is the fact that you're connected by a broker make it more likely that you be connected through time. Excuse me, my auto advance seems to be on for some reason. So we looked at that through time, and this plot, I want to get used to how seeing this, because we'll see a few of these a little bit later. But the x-axis there in green shows the strength of the brokerage connection in the first time period, and the y-axis in blue shows how much more similar two sites were in the next period through time, suggesting they were strengthening connections. So anything that goes up and to the right suggests closure. That suggests that we're seeing more connection among sites that were characterized by high brokerage relationships earlier through time. So altogether, essentially what we're seeing is a pattern where sites characterized by a high degree of brokerage tended to be short-lived, small, and low population density areas, and we tended to see closure through time. And this was a really strong fit for the collectivist model of brokerage we saw in this literature search. And essentially, could we then take, some of the risks and rewards and values that were associated with relationships in those settings and then extrapolate those to the Southwest? Those were settings where we saw tight-knit relationships among groups being valued highly. And if we see that the same thing in this archaeological case, we could maybe speculate about what kinds of relationships were driving regional interactions in the Southwest in that time period. And that was a study. I was really happy with that study. Randy and I published this, and we were happy with it. But I couldn't leave well enough alone. And then as the Southwest Social Networks project extended in time, we then started to gather data from the Chaco world. And Chaco is this huge, important cultural manifestation in northwestern New Mexico that's characterized by massive architecture, overbuilt great houses, as they're called, great kivas. And these structures are sort of massive structures that then have many sites in other places in the world, or other places across the Chaco world, that are connected in varying degrees in terms of architectural similarities, materials, cultural similarities in general. But Chaco was something that a lot of archaeologists have talked about Chaco as being sort of something different than a lot of what came before or after it. It's a different scale in terms of the size of structures. It's a different scale in terms of the investment in architecture that we see there. And we see this sort of spread across the Southwest. So this map shows Chaco right there in the orange bubble in the center there. And then you could see across the entire region, going all the way up into southeast Utah, southwestern Colorado, all the way down to the Mogollon Rim, we have structures that show architectural similarities to those in Chaco that then are developed across this entire region, suggesting some sorts of relationships between them. And that was really what we wanted to do with the Southwest Social Networks Project version 2, was to investigate relationships across this Chaco world through time, to look at how these great house communities outside of Chaco Canyon related to the center of the Chaco world in general. And so that project went on for a while, and after a little while, decided to look at that question of brokerage again in the Chaco region. And this wasn't just an arbitrary thing. We had a general idea that maybe something different was going on in this region, because things we know about Chaco is that Chaco is a place that has a lot of external materials from other places show up, including beams used to build structures coming from long distances away, pottery from long distances away. We have turquoise from long distance away, things like chocolate and chili and things like that coming from very far distances away, objects associated with Mesoamerica. So we had reason to believe that maybe relationships circling around and involving Chaco were somewhat different than what we'd seen in other times and places. So that was kind of why we looked at this. And when we started to investigate brokerage in relation to the Chaco world, what we found is that rather than being in the physiographic peripheries and in places that are characterized by low population density, what we actually saw was it was the big places with all the big great houses were the sites that were characterized by the highest degree of brokerage. So these are Chaco Canyon itself, and then later Aztec, which was sort of a site that's related to the later developments in Chaco in the Middle San Juan region to the north. As well. So we saw that geographic pattern. So already we were thinking, okay, something very different is happening in terms of the geographic distribution of brokerage in the Chaco era than we saw earlier. So if we look at population, again, it's the reverse pattern. Rather than higher brokerage being associated with lower population, higher brokerage was associated with higher population, but again, only during the height of Chaco. This is not true before or after, which is really interesting. It's only really that period from 950 to 1150 is really where this is true, and before and after that we don't see that same pattern. So that was really intriguing. And thinking about the geographic distribution of brokerage, one of the things that's characteristic of Chaco is roads. There's roads across the Chaco landscape. There are these straight shot roads that go many miles, and there's many smaller roads in and around features. And one of the things that I thought I noticed when looking at these data is that there seemed to be higher brokerage scores for sites that were in the road network portion of this region. And this is a plot here that shows through time how sites in blue, the box plots in blue show brokerage scores for sites that are within 10 kilometers of road, and sites and box plots in red show those that are more than 10 kilometers from a road. And this showed that through time, there's definitely a higher concentration of brokerage scores in the road network. But this could be maybe just because the San Juan Basin, where most of the roads are, or where most of this is. But if we even limit our analysis only to the central San Juan Basin, during the height of Chaco, being close to a road was still a driver of brokerage. The sites that are closest to the road still have the highest brokerage scores, even if you only consider the distribution of the main road network within the central San Juan Basin. So I really think there's something to that. We talked about closure, and certainly in the late prehispanic period, we had a lot of evidence for closure. And essentially, I'm going to add a red line to these plots, and anything that's going up from these red lines is evidence of closure, essentially. And anything that's below the red line or even with the red line is evidence of a lack of closure there. So what we see is that in the late prehispanic period, as we'd already shown, in general, if a site was connected by a broker in one time period, those two sites were going to be more closely connected to each other in the next time period. In the Chaco region, that's not true at all. If two sites were connected by a broker in one time period, that doesn't really influence how much more or less connected they are in the next period. And actually, in the peak of the Chaco interval, they're less connected to each other through time. So it's actually suggesting that sites that were in brokerage positions were limiting relationships from developing among sites that they were connecting. So they're it's more of a hub and spoke sort of model where you have a center place connected to lots of places that are not themselves connected to each other. And that's really different than what we saw in the late prehispanic period. So comparing these two models, it was really interesting because essentially during the late prehispanic period, we have really good evidence of that collectivist model of brokerage. We have brokerage associated with peripheral areas and physiographic transitions, low population density, short-lived sites, and closure. And during the height of the Chaco world, this period of increased centralization and hierarchy, brokerage was associated with the center of the Chaco world with high population density, with prominent settlements, and there's a lack of closure during the height of Chaco expansion. So it's really two different things are happening in these time periods. And this to me is really exciting because I think a lot of network analysis have tried to look at how risks and rewards change over time and how that could influence outcomes of networks like this, right? But this is one of the only settings where we can actually look at this over the course of centuries, right? There's not really any other way other than archaeological record to look at this over centuries. And what this shows is during the peak of the Chaco world, there was a different set of relationships that were in values that were playing out between network position and outcome than before or after. And I think that's really fascinating. And I didn't go into this here, but there's a couple of other places in the Southwest that seem to also provide some exceptions to this. And one of the others is Paquime in Northwest Mexico during the height of Paquime as well. So right away, if we start to talk about the exceptions to a rule being places like Chaco and Paquime, which are places that are characterized by a much more hierarchical centralization than we see in other times in places in the Southwest, that makes me think maybe there's a general relationship between that kind of centralization and the way people value the risks and rewards of network position. And that's kind of one of the things that I'd like to do next is investigate this a little bit further in a broader comparative sphere. And for example, in Cahokia, in the American Midwest, people have made a very similar argument that during the height of Cahokia itself was the central node in sort of monitoring the flows of through the network. Ken Hirth and others made a similar argument about Chalcatzingo in Mesoamerica being the sort of gateway community connecting other relationships through time. So really what we're seeing is that Chaco, the height of Chaco, the relationship between network position and outcome seems to be more similar to a lot of other hierarchical settlements in places like Mesoamerica and elsewhere, in North America and the Southwest, and in other parts of the North America. So that's something that I really want to investigate further. And to me, this sort of pushes me to think, there's been a lot of arguments about Chaco being different in many ways. And this really suggests that there really were some different social processes going on in terms of the way interaction was valued through time. So to me, this is the kind of question that we can only really ask and answer with archaeological evidence like this. And this is why this project's been very exciting to me, this Cyber Southwest project, because for the first time, we're able to actually have the information. It's really readily available now. So there's a lot of questions we can sort of ask and answer about how not just network processes, but any sort of process that involves material culture change through time plays out not just in one place, but across an entire broad region. And that's something that I think is really exciting. And I'm hoping that, by the time I retire, we have the ability to do this across North America, or, even at a broader scale. I think that would be very exciting. And I think, it's kind of like that revolution in paleobiology, but by gathering the data, we're able to ask questions at a scale that we haven't really previously been able to ask. And thinking about networks and archaeology, I just wanted to plug briefly a couple of books that have recently come out that relate to this. So Network Science and Archaeology is a book by Tom Brookmans and I, which is sort of a textbook where you can sort of learn the history of networks and archaeology and learn more about it. And then we have the Oxford Handbook of Archaeological Network Research, which is out now, edited by Tom Brookmans, Barbara Mills, Jessica Munson, and myself. And that's really like a state-of-the-art book. It has 42 chapters that go into just like everything that people are doing with networks and archaeology these days. And that's sort of an exciting thing. It's an expensive book, so maybe you look for it in your local library. But that's a great sort of overview of this. And I'm excited that networks have increased in popularity in archaeology, and I'm hoping that these books can kind of push new methods and models out there into the world in a way that they haven't been previously. So with that, I just want to say thank you to the AHS for the invitation here, and thanks to all the funders of this research and the collaborators on the Cyber Southwest projects. Everything that I talked about here is the product of the whole team of people. I want to say that from here. So thank you to all those collaborators that are continuing to work on this project as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. You gave us lots of food for thought. I think one of my first questions is that what is the largest physiographic region that you guys have studied so far?
Let me see if I can pull that slide back up. I may have.
Was it Mesoamerica? I know you had a lot of information on that graph, and I was trying to figure out the scale of the largest project that you guys have worked on so far.
Yeah. So essentially, we have done work that has encompassed everything from. I'm just going to go to the first slide. There's a map there. So we've got data all the way to the Salt Lake, essentially down into Northwest Mexico at the Sinaloa border, all the way to Texas, and then all the way west into California. So we've got kind of this big area. The initial project had focused on the areas west of the Continental Divide, and since then the project has grown, and there's been a few analyses that have been done at that whole scale. So the original Ringo and Las Vegas to Las Vegas kind of scope of the Southwest.
Interesting. And I was also wondering, what kind of an impact has this type of research had on dissertations in terms of are people collecting more data? Are they just synthesizing the data that you guys have? Have you seen a trajectory or a trend in terms of people looking at the data sources that you have rather than going out and collecting new data?
Yeah, I think we're doing both, but I think these data are providing kind of a good context for people to get started. Going back to the Coalescent Communities database, which I used to manage at Archaeology Southwest, the people that were largely applying for using the data were graduate students. They were essentially like, they wanted all the data in their area so they could have the context and background from the work they're doing. And I think that's where a lot of people are using this as well now, is they're essentially using it to supplement work they're doing in a particular place by having that. But in addition to that, there's been 2 dissertations at least already, and several more in progress that have been really based specifically on these data and the development of these methods and things like that. So,
okay. I have a question from one of our Zoom participants, and she asks, will you be adding information on more of the southern New Mexico, specifically the Jornada, anytime soon? And is there a way folks could facilitate that?
Yes, we can definitely talk about that. We have some data from the Jornada already, but we're definitely interested in any more that exists. And you can sort of see on this map here, this map, any dot that's shown is a site over 12 rooms. That's just sort of an arbitrary convention for that map. But we actually do have data even beyond that as well, what's shown on this map. But if people are interested, I would suggest you go to cybersw.org and look at the website. There has information about how people contribute to that. And you'll get you in touch with the folks at Archaeology Southwest that are managing the database itself. But we're definitely interested in people that have things to add helping us.
Another question from our Zoom audience. Are you thinking that the 2 models, the individual versus collective, represent the models likely in place during different types of social aggregation and movement? So for example, model 1, individualist, where aggregation is slow in the beginning, and then model 2, collectivist, Chaco, for the stable aggregated stages.
Yeah, I think the title switched there, but that's how I see it also. Essentially, I think the collectivist model does characterize this period where there's a lot of population movement, and there's essentially establishment of new communities. There's a lot of churn in communities in that era. And during the Chaco era, there's a lot more stability from time period to time period, and that could be something that's related to this. there's actually an archaeologist who's working in Africa who, after I talked about this in a place where they saw this, had shown me some data from that region that had a very similar pattern. There was a period characterized by a high degree of migration. Brokerage was very limited in its utility for the individual broker, but during a period of stability, it was highly associated with positive outcomes for people. So mobility could be another part of this, and I think that's definitely something worth investigating further.
And the speculation on the brokerage level, are we talking about household levels? Are we talking about individuals? Are we talking about familiar ties types of thing? What do you guys, when you talk about the brokers, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in every community, right? Because we're essentially looking at the level of settlement. And one of the things that Barbara Mills and I had a chapter in Southwest Symposium volume where we talked about this, about 2 different places that were characterized by really similar levels of diversity. But in one of those settings, all of the households had essentially everything that made the community diverse. And another one of those settings, it was like 6 really homogenous households that all happen to be part of the same structure. And those are 2 really different patterns in terms of relationships, but at the community level, they look the same, right? So I think that's one of those things where to investigate the individual way these things play out, that's going to take targeted work in specific places. And I think that we've started to do that a little bit, comparing the Silver Creek area and kind of parts of Western New Mexico in that way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to open it up to our lecture. Does anyone have any questions here at the group? In our outside setting. Okay.
Yeah. Hopefully the road noise wasn't too bad.
We hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Matt, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You gave us a lot to think about. It's fascinating. And we really appreciate you coming down and talking to us tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks
And
everybody for logging in too.
yeah. And as we wrap up tonight, I want to remind everyone that we do not have a live lecture in January. We have a winter party that's taking place in Tucson at Fort Lowell Park. And if you want more information, please go to our website on arizona-arcandhis.org to look at our webpage for information. And we will see you back on in-person lectures in February. We'll be featuring Dr. Ben Valorado, and he'll be talking to us live from U of A then. Until then, thank you very much and have a great night.